At 6 o'clock then, if you... On the 9th day of May, 1950, at 6 p.m., at the Quai d'Orsay in Paris, the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman gave a 3-minute speech in which he laid the foundation for the European house in which today 500 million Europeans live together in peace. Speaking of a world peace to end centuries-old rivalries and of Europe's shared destiny and responsibilities to the world, it may have seemed rather mundane simply to propose the European coal and steel community. Yet this economic project was a political expression of Christian ideals of forgiveness and reconciliation, the precursor to permanent peace. This was the defining moment of post-war Europe, for it launched the European movement for peace and unity that has led to today's European Union. So, welcome to this month's Schuman Talk, where we discuss issues facing Europeans today in the light of Robert Schuman's vision for a community of peoples deeply rooted in Christian values. Tonight, our special guests, Dr. Blaj and Professor Wolfgang Palaver, will be joining us later in the program to help us understand post-war reconciliation between France and Germany especially through the lens of something called the mimetic theory, the creation of one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th and 21st centuries, Rene Girard. If you've never heard his name, neither had I, until my Schuman Center colleague, Marie Blaj, introduced him to me. She has just earned her doctorate based on Girard's insights and thinking. Now, according to The Guardian, mimetic theory is like putting on a pair of glasses and seeing the world come into focus. At its heart is an idea so simple and yet so fundamental that it seems incredible that no one had articulated it before. Now, before Mari and Wolfgang join us, we're going to watch a video interview with Girard by Peter Robinson of the Hoover Institute of Stanford University in the US, where Girard was emeritus professor. It will introduce Rene Gerard to us and then address the following questions. What is mimetic desire and how can it lead to conflict? What is the scapegoating mechanism? Is Christianity a myth? What is religion in the modern world? And it will conclude with Girard's personal story of his encounter with Christianity. So let's listen to this video before we meet our guests, Marie Blaj and Wolfgang Palaver.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/UNC Knowledge, twitter.com/Unc Knowledge. Born in Avignon on Christmas Day 1923, René Girard is the author of works that have been published in more than 24 languages, including The Scapegoat and Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. His latest book, Archivé Clausewitz, will be published in the United States in 2010 as battling to the end: politics, war, and apocalypse. In 2005, Professor Girard received the highest honor in France, induction as one of the 40 members of the Académie Française. One source of Rene Girard's thinking, a close reading of The Golden Bough, Sir James Fraser's classic study of ancient myths. Published in 1890, The Golden Bough explained that myths throughout the ancient world contained a central element: the periodic sacrifice of a sacred king, dying and then resurrected. Christianity, The Golden Bough suggested, represented nothing but one more such myth, a point to which we will return. René Girard, bienvenue.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Segment 1, Insights. Mimetic desire. To quote one of your interpreters, Gil Bailey, quote, "Desire, as distinguished from animal appetite, is always aroused by the desire of another." Explain.
If, in order to invent desire, because desire is not natural, desire is not animal. Is it human? We don't know. It sometimes is human, sometimes it seems very inhuman. But how is it born? I think desire usually is born out of the contemplation of someone else who is desiring and who designates to you the object is desiring as desirable.
So every college student who wants to be an investment banker, obvious, they want to fly around in their own jet and
Yes.
drive a Maserati. But how does this apply to the ancient world?
Well, to the ancient world, it has to apply in the same fashion. The objects are different, but the structure of desire, the triangular relationship of desire, object, model, and subject are the same.
Serpent, Eve, apple.
Serpent in the mimetic theory of desire is a symbol, an image of the mediator. In other words, the one who directs the subject towards the bad desire. The churches, who know what they're talking about much better than most people think, know that example is the key to bad as well as good behavior. And this is nothing but what I call mimetic desire.
So that's why the church uses the phrase, the occasion of sin.
Yes.
Now, Gil Bailey, once again, the imitative nature of desire leads to conflict.
It leads to conflict, and this is both something very obvious and which is a paradox for most people when they first realize it. If you imitate the desire of someone else, you admire that someone else, or that someone else may be your best friend. But as soon as you both desire the same object, and the objects really desirable exist only in one copy.
In ones.
So I shouldn't say copy because it's not a copy. It's the original.
There is only one
one
Helen of Troy.
Original. And therefore they have to fight. Therefore the theatrical situation par excellence is a situation of two people desiring the same object because they designate that object to each other. Once the imitated subject realizes he is imitated, this reinforces his desire. He said, I certainly selected the right object. As soon as this man saw her, he fell in love with her, like I did. Therefore, we are right. Therefore, I'm more convinced than ever that I should desire her. Therefore, he's my enemy.
Right. I'm chuckling because as the audience will learn, as simple as it sounds, it explains everything in a way. Let me quote you yourself, Rene, this time. if this moves on to your second basic insight, the violence and the sacred. If there is a normal order in societies, it must be the fruit of an anterior crisis. Explain.
It must be the result of an anterior crisis because people polarize around objects of desire. And this can be regarded as true even for food, for shelter, for places where you can live and so forth. So you can be sure that the human population in prehistorical time gathered around the same places because they were desirable, because there was water there and so forth. And they were united by that same desire. And they were separated because very often there was not enough of whatever was needed, water, shelter, food, and they started to fight. That's why I don't think we should say man is so bad, that he will always fight with his fellow man, even when he associates, the people he associates most closely with are the people he fights most often with. They do because they are both moving toward the same thing. And these things are never in sufficient number. Or even if they are, you tend to trust your model.
All right.
Because you admire him. So you say he's seen in the object something more than I saw, and therefore I must follow him more than ever. And this works both ways. As the one who desires first is imitated in his desire, he's confirmed in that desire. But the conflictual situation is all over the place, it's coming from everywhere.
All right. Segment 2, the scapegoating mechanism. We now have, let's say we're in the prehistoric world. You're describing the most basic sources of conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And now the most basic means of resolving conflict.
Yeah, because the question is how such conflicts resolved. They have to be resolved at least part of the time for groups of human beings to gather permanently together and so forth.
So the question is, how do societies manage to exist?
People imitate each other. People imitate each other in their desire. But they also imitate each other in their dislikes, I just said. And therefore, when you have a conflict which is particularly visible and obvious and so forth, there will be a tendency for the neighbors of the people concerned to move with the stronger of the two, the most convincing of the two, and be on his side against the other one. And when you have a second one, you have a third one, a fourth one, it becomes easier and easier. And the mimetic, because all this is always mimetic. You see, that's the thing you have to see. The real motor is imitation each time. Imitation of friendship, imitation of desire, and imitation of conflict. So, if it is so, there should not be any human society. It should be impossible.
Total conflict all the time.
Total conflict all the time. But if you have the total conflict, you also have a way in which this conflict is automatically, cancelled and resolved by. And it is when people imitate no longer the choice of opponent, but also what they feel about everything. And they are all going to gather against the same opponent. If one really feels convinced that one of the people there is more guilty than the other one, the notion of guilt will appear in the collective interplay of these people. And as soon as this happens, it gathers speeds, and ultimately one victim must be killed or driven out or otherwise gotten rid of. And this is what I call this, what not I, but everybody calls the scapegoat. The word scapegoat comes from the Bible, the Tyndale translation of the Bible in English. In most European languages, they say emissary goat, emissary victim, victim who is sent out of the community or who is killed. You see, but that's when everybody agrees that there must be one who is more of a culprit than the others. Therefore, they unite against that one.
And this mechanism is what underlies these myths that Fraser cataloged all around the world, not just Western, not just Greek and Roman myths, although that, of course, is where he
and that's what he doesn't see, because he excludes the West. The West is too high, too intelligent, too superior to the rest of humanity to be part. Fraser discovers only archaic or primitive society scapegoats,
and so
African scapegoats.
It is your belief that the pattern that underlies myths around the world of the dying and resurrected king reflects actual events in prehistoric society. And we're talking about, we have to establish the scope of time we're discussing here. You're actually talking about early Homo sapiens, 500,000 years.
Early,
so this goes on for hundreds of thousands of years.
I'm not
and becomes
interested
ritualized in myth.
In finding out the exact time. It's not my business. I'm a pure theoretician. You see, but I say at some point, people must have been reconciled in order to create communities, permanent communities, against not a leader directly, but a scapegoat. That they all killed together and it united them. That's why if you look at myth, they all have the same shape. It's always a story of a man who is killed by an entire community.
Oedipus, mythical king of Thebes. The plague comes to Thebes. Yeah. Oedipus discovers that years before, unwittingly, he had killed his father and mother. He's horrified. He blinds himself.
It's a community that discovers that.
All right, that's what I want. So we know the Oedipus myth. Explain how that...
And Oedipus is killed. Therefore, the community gathers around Oedipus because Oedipus has solved the problem in a way of the disunity of the community by dying. After the death of Oedipus, people find that they have no more enemy. And they have a moment where they say, this man divided us, but in order to reconcile us. Therefore, he's a God. Therefore, he is the one who is moving us towards some kind of new form of unity. Not against him, but we should be afraid of him, but he's fundamentally good. He's a God.
All right. Segment 3. The myth that happened. The crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. Luke chapter 23. Now when the centurion saw what was done, he glorified God, saying, certainly, this was a righteous man. And the people smote their breasts.
You hit the right spot there because you mentioned immediately what myth cannot say. Myth never see that the victim is innocent. You see.
Oedipus really did kill his father and mother. He really did bear guilt.
Right. And the first interpreters of the myth took it quite seriously because they saw violence as the main business of myth. And therefore, they believed it was a real murderer who had been killed. In reality, it's an imaginary murderer, a scapegoat.
But the community believed in his guilt.
The community believed in his guilt. That's why the community wanted to repeat these things, thought that the God was teaching them to repeat it to new, more victims. That's why they invented sacrifice.
All right. And so when in the Golden Bough, Fraser suggests that Christianity, and he has as much of a shock on late 19th century, the West, as did Darwin.
Yeah, but at
he's
least
less known now, but it's still that Christianity is nothing but one more myth that takes the pattern of the dying and resurrected God. And Fraser believed it, and so intellectuals to this day believe it. And you answer how?
I answer very simply that Fraser was perfectly right to point to the similarities between myth and Christianity. In both instances, you have a victim who is killed by an entire community and who becomes the god of, or who becomes, or who is, who's always been, in case of Christ, of the community. What Fraser didn't see, which is the simplest thing of all, and should convince everybody immediately, if they were honest, that Christianity is very different from mythology while being the same. It's exactly the same situation. Is that Christianity tells you that Christ was innocent, whereas all myths tell you the victim is guilty. The victim is a god, but gods are guilty characters. They are dangerous characters. They can be good to you through strange circumstances that are not very easy to understand, but they can also do all sorts of bad things, which is not the case of Christ. Simply, Christianity tells you Christ is innocent. And people don't see that it's the first time in the history of mankind that a myth occurs which is read not falsely with the victim guilty, but with the victim innocent, sent by God himself. If God allows scapegoating to happen, it's because he wants humanity to exist and so forth. But of course, Christ is very different from any other scapegoat, and he's the Son of God, and he is misunderstood when people see him as exactly the same thing as mythical heroes. He's a mythical hero, but he's innocent.
Rene, why, this is the question of soterology, if I am pronouncing it correctly, the theologians, the theology of the cross. What changes when this innocent God-man dies on the cross? How does that affect human understanding? Why is that a saving event?
Well, because if you read the mythical situation the way I just did, you see, you can see there is something which is not purely human about it. We are offered all these victims and we take them for culprits and so forth. In the case of Christianity, there are a few disciples who say, no, he's not guilty, who maintain to the end that he is innocent, whatever people may say about him. Therefore, they say the truth, simply. They say a truth which is anthropological before being religious, but which is the same thing.
And so Christ's death on the cross frees humankind from this deep, profound, inescapable, and largely hidden cycle of the scapegoating impulse.
Yes. Potentially it does. It does. And Christianity asserts certainly that it does. That is the only true religion, and that it says the truth about man and about God. But very few people take these statements seriously, as you well know. And they should take them literally.
Why? You have said it several points now. It's obvious once you see it. It's the simplest. Christianity is different, and yet, and yet
they don't want it.
They don't want it.
But you know as much about that as I do. I mean, we just have to see the fact that they don't see both. You see, the Christians don't dare see the similarity because they are too timid. If you
They're afraid that Christianity may be one other myth.
May be a myth. Therefore, they refuse to say the situation is a mythical one. But they say the truth about it, and there is no more myth. Christianity destroys mythology.
All right. Segment 4, Rene Girard and the Modern World. From your most recent book, Archive Clausewitz, to be published in this country under the title Battling to the End. Quote, history, you might say, is a test for mankind, but we know very well that mankind is failing that test. Explain.
Mankind is failing that test because mankind has the truth in the reality of Christianity, which is there. And this truth has been there for 2,000 years. And instead of moving ahead and becoming more widespread, today it's becoming more restricted. Christianity is less and less popular every day and is accused of all sorts of things, which smell very much like a scapegoating process.
Well, all right. So in the contemporary setting, we have Christopher Hitchens saying that Christianity is responsible for all kinds of evils.
Yeah.
It's the usual catalog. I don't mean to demean Christopher's argument. He's a man of integrity, but the religious warfare, on and on. And you say, no, that's not Christianity. It is what?
But it is an effort to restore, if you want, the mythical world, which doesn't perceive itself as it should.
To unite by way of a common antagonism, and then to do violence to the other. Mm-hmm. What we see in the religious warfare, what we see in the communism, is a reemergence of the ancient pattern.
What we see in human society as a whole, in a way, people are always united around victims. But in order to unite solidly, they must keep believing that these victims are guilty. And they are not. So, in other words, Christianity is the myth that reads all myth, the myth which is read and reads all myth. So people say, you're doing anthropology or you're doing mythology. And I answer, no. I'm showing that to read mythology right and to have a true anthropology are one and the same thing.
From Battling to the End again, Modern World. Personally, I have the impression that Islam has used the Bible, that is, incorporated elements of the Bible, as a support to rebuild an archaic religion. While Christianity eliminates sacrifice wherever it gains a foothold, Islam seems to situate itself prior to that rejection.
Yeah, Christianity, Islam is a big problem for Christianity because it comes after Christianity. And it is intelligent enough and religious enough in a certain sense to use aspects of Christianity that make it more credible than archaic religion. Therefore, but I think it's very important to realize that it's not the same message, really. It seems to be, but it's not the same message. Because the peace and the refusal of violence of Christianity is not there.
And yet you also argue in Battling to the End that terrorism is something new and alien to the classical Islamic tradition.
Yes.
Where does it come from, and what's the correct way for us to think about it?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, well...
This is television. Make up an answer, René.
No, I don't want to make up an answer.
No, this
is too serious a question, because you're talking about millions and millions of people.
Of course. In some way...
these people are honest. Now, as a Christian, I would say they are potential Christians. We want to convert each other, and it's a normal thing to do. Mm-hmm. We want all the Muslims to become Christians, just as the Muslims want all the Christians to become Muslim.
Now, in Battling to the End, you argue that the modern world finds itself in a peculiar predicament. The archaic pattern no longer works because it's been exposed. It's impossible to be a genuine pagan. After the Christian event, you just can't go back. It has happened. So it no longer works. At the same time, that is to say, it no longer is genuinely unifying. It no longer is ritualized in myths that people at least half believe. And at the same time, we have the march of technology making the scapegoating mechanism more and more dangerous.
Yes, we have we might simply say that man has become capable of destroying his own world for good,
And
to make it unable to support life, to destroy the atmosphere. I take very seriously. Today we live a very strange period, because the apocalyptic texts, the great apocalyptic texts for me, are not the texts which are entitled Apocalypse of John. They are the texts which are at the end of the
Gospels.
Of the synoptic Gospels, especially Luke and
the reading last Sunday. The end of the world will come.
That's right.
The end of the world will come, but it is not for you to know the time.
In the old days, I remember before the invention of the atom bomb, priests in church always talked about these apocalyptic texts on the last day of the year, of the liturgical year, which was the last day of the time after Pentecost, which was a week ago, and the first day of the Advent, which was an apocalyptic day too. These texts were read, and I remember the time when they were the only thing that impressed me very much in readings at church, and in a way, the inspiration of my whole work is there. I have been talking about these texts all the time.
Well, final quotation from Battling to the End. In some way, the Gospels and Scriptures are predicting that mankind will fail the test of history, since they end with eschatological themes, literally the end of the world. How do you think about the present age? Is this a time of testing? Is it a time of ultimate doom?
Well, look at the apocalyptic text in the Gospel. One thing which is very characteristic is the mixture of the human and the natural. That is the reason why people consider that they are not serious scientifically and so forth and so forth. But look at the times we are living today. If there is a new hurricane in New Orleans, is it nature alone, or is it nature helped by man? So to be in apocalyptic times means precisely that, in my view. The time when you no longer know if it is nature which is hurting you, or if it is man himself who is helping the apocalyptic forces.
Rene, segment 5, your personal story. You've been quoted as saying that you've undergone 2 conversions, and the first was intellectual. The intellectual conversion occurred, I'm assuming, when reading The Golden Bough, you recognized that Christianity was different. Am I correct about that?
Yes, but this is not necessarily a Christian. It's the encounter of these texts with the Gospels, which convinced me. And then when I realized precisely that it's this mixture, there will be the sea and the roaring of the waves and so forth, and man will fight man, and city against city and so forth. It's always symmetrical, like what I call the doubles, the basic conflictual situation. When you realize that these 2 things are one.
I'm looking to you for a little cheer here. The apocalyptic, when I was a teenager, the apocalyptic texts impressed me as well. They scared the wits out of me. And in fact, I can remember hearing a country preacher talking about he somehow or other had the hydrogen bomb predicted in the book of Revelation.
People want to be scared today. All their films and so forth. The only
Paranormal
fear,
Activities is a big hit.
The only fear they refuse is a good one. The one that says there must be a God there who is in charge and who can reward as well as punish.
Do you believe, I've got a question here from a viewer, Todd Jones. Does Rene Girard believe that there is any way to turn the tide?
Yes, behaving like Christians.
All right. Now, Rene, to conclude, would you indulge me in concluding this interview? I would like to ask you to be my personal guide here and demonstrate to me a close Girardian reading of a text. I'll give you a couple of passages and ask you to comment on it. Luke chapter 1. And the angel came in unto her and said, Hail, thou that art highly favored, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. And when she saw him, she was troubled at his saying. And the angel said unto her, Fear not, Mary, for thou hast found favor with God. What is that woman doing in the Christian myth?
Well, that Christian is part, that woman is part is very important. Part is Mary, and she's the mother of the child who is Christ and who is the Son of God, who is the presence of God on this earth. Therefore, it's very important. Protestant and Catholics give various different importance to Mary and so forth. I don't think it's very important. The importance is to see that it justifies, in a way, history in a religious way. That history is both human and divine, and that the consequences, in a way, are always manifest by God.
There's no stagecraft here. There's no melodrama. There is no melodrama. You have a simple girl who's scared witless.
That's right.
All right. Chapter 2. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And Joseph went up from Galilee into Judea, into the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. And so it was that while they were there, Mary brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them at the inn. This is an odd appearance for the God, the dying and resurrected God, to be making.
Well, it is the proof and the statement that what is really going on the historical plane has very little to do with the Roman Empire and what was going on in the world in the 2nd century AD.
So we begin with, in effect, the front page of the New York Times, Caesar Augustus decree, and then the gospel immediately shows us what is important is a secret, ordinary human truth here.
That's right.
Taking place in a little out of the way.
Yeah, but taking place only in one place, being unique, being something which has to be discovered, which we cannot afford to say, oh, well, okay, it's there, it's unimportant. No, it's not unimportant. It's destiny and the duty of our life to look for the truth, which is hidden from the point of view of the Roman Empire.
Final passage, Luke chapter 2. And there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them. And suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host praising God and saying, Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men.
Yeah.
Rene, you remember the Second World War. You lived in occupied Paris, the Second World War, 50 million dead, the Holocaust, the tens of millions killed by the communists, all in your lifetime. How do you make sense of, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men?
Well, the first sense to make is that most men, and especially the most powerful, were not full of peace and good intentions. And, well, human life is essentially drama. And maybe one thing the churches don't emphasize enough is that human beings like drama. they would like to be part of an immense fight between good and evil and so forth. What these texts say is that in their own way, each one of them is part of that struggle, which I think is very important and very hopeful.
The ordinary Christian,
yes,
is not going to read every word of the Girard Reader or every word of your many books. Can you sum up?
It's really very unimportant. He may have insights which are more profound than mine, and he should believe and he should trust that he's a very important man for God, and that his understanding of reality as a religious history is an event that rejoices God.
Rene Girard, thank you very much. I should say Joyeux Noël.
Joyeux Noël. Merry Christmas.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge in the Hoover Institution. Thanks for joining us. Well,
so now it's time to introduce our guests tonight, Dr. Mari Blaj and Professor Wolfgang Palaver. Now, Mari has been associated with the Schuman Center for almost the past decade, living in Iași in Romania, close to the Moravian border. And hello, Wolfgang, nice to have you with us as well.
Hello.
And Mari has been very much involved organizing all sorts of Schuman Center activities, seminars, conferences, and was recently awarded her doctorate, summa cum laude, interpreting the history of the Carthaginian Wars in the Mediterranean through Rene Girard's theories. So welcome, Mari, and welcome, Wolfgang. Wolfgang is a professor in the Department of Systematic Theology in the University of Innsbruck. He's been on Schuman activities several times in the past, has published extensively in German and in English on religion and violence, including the book called Rene Girard's Mimetic Theory. And that's a very, very good starting point if you want to understand more. Tonight, we want to explore the event that we started off this program recalling, and that was on May the 9th, 1950, when Robert Schuman announced his plan for a coal and steel community. That was the first step towards what has become the European Union. And I want to ask you both, what can Rene Girard tell us about European post-war reconciliation? And secondly, what can he say about the way forward for a Europe in search of a new identity? So how does Girard's theory help us understand what happened between France and Germany after the war? Because it seems to me that something very historic, unprecedented was taking place then, where the defeated party was taken as an equal. And this has created 70 years of peace between habitual enemies. So we're going to ask the ladies first. Mari, if you would share, and then Wolfgang to follow. Thank you very much, Mari.
For having me. I'm glad to be in this dialogue together with Professor Palaver, who had a very significant influence in my focus on using Girard's theories for history. Well, as you said, Jeff, contemporary history is not my field. So I came to this discussion with the lessons that I learned from looking into a long 7 years history of conflicts between Carthage and other powers in the Mediterranean. So the way that I look to the relationship between Germany and France, it's of course not only through Girardian lens, but also through the lens that I learned looking into Carthaginian history. Well, first of all, Girard wrote about the relationship between France and Germany in a book that he mentioned in the in that interview. In English is better to the end. In French is, I don't know how to put it in order to see it, as Achevez Clausewitz. I guess Professor Palaver will refer to the book. I'll not do it too much. What I want to say is that France was the hegemonic power in Europe for centuries. And in being such, France was the model. And what Girard offers us through his theory is to look to the model becoming an obstacle. So France became an obstacle for Germany, who by the beginning of the 20th century was a very industrialized country. And we could look to, if somebody could help us technically, to look to a schema that I sent. Is it possible? Thank you very much. The relationship between the subject, who is France, and who is Germany, and the model, who is France, is related to an object of desire. Well, France, like Spain, like Portugal, like Holland, like England, they were big colonial powers. Germany was looking for resources. At the first, the first thing that we can see is that what was there to dispute between France and Germany was the power, the access to resources. But Girard always underlined that beyond the object, the concrete object, there is a metaphysic desire. So it's the desire to be the first one. Anyway, this conflict between Germany and France, it's a long one. It's not only in the Second World War. France became an obstacle, in Girard's words. Then we have the war, and we are, by the end of the war, we could go to the next part of my schema. And in 1950, what we have is a post-conflict situation. So after a generalized violence, after polarization of the world, after the unanimous violence, we are now in a situation where the former rivals came together, and it's a new social order, it's a new culture coming out of a generalized conflict. Is not the only thing that comes out of that conflict. The Cold War is the result of this reconciliation of the former rivals.
Rivalry.
Yeah, so it's a rivalry solved in the reconciliation against a third one, which is Soviet Union. There is the disintegration of the former empires, land empires after the First World War, and the Navy, maritime empire disintegration after the Second World War. This is another aspect of reconfiguration of the world after a conflict. Well, a very significant idea from Girard is that the model could avoid being or becoming an obstacle. And Girard refers to Christ as a model who always refers to the Father. He also refers to Apostle Paul, who invites us to walk in his steps as he walks in somebody else's steps, named Christ. Girard also refers to the Father as being a non-conflictual model. What we have in the relationship between Schuman and Adenauer and between France and Germany in 1950 is France positioned itself as non-conflictual, non-obstacle model.
Now, thank you for those diagrams too, and that very helpful to begin to apply what Girard was talking about in this particular situation. And I know, Wolfgang, this has been a long specialty of yours, and I understand you initiate numerous academic conferences along these themes, and so I'm very much looking forward to your input to help us understand what took place that has actually led to these 7 decades of peace.
Your question is a little bit difficult because Girard is very strong in his analysis, as Mari pointed out. He sees the key source of human violence. The key source of human violence is mimetic rivalry, is rivalry caused by desiring the same object as your model desires. And this goes back to sibling rivalry in the more smaller ways and settings we are living together. And in his last book, Girard, for the first time, used and applied this model of mimetic rivalry to understand the history between France and Germany. And there was even a TV series coming out just a couple, close 2 years or so after Girard's book, Battling to the End, or Aschewe Clausewitz, which shows that really from the very beginning, there was always mimetic rivalry between France and Germany. One time France was the model, then Germany became the model. So this was a rivalry. And if we look for the object of desire that was responsible partly for this type of rivalry, we see its temporal power, its political power, its financial means, its land. And so if we look, because your question was focusing on what happened after the Second World War, why suddenly could these two arch enemies reconcile? Why could these two arch enemies become the pillar of a unified Europe? And Girard doesn't say a lot about it. And I was rereading yesterday the key passages in order to give a short answer. And it's very interesting. He discusses this question when he focuses on a famous French writer, Madame de Staël. And she was visiting Germany and was very fond of Germany. And there are certain types of reconciliation that is very important for Madame de Staël, but it's also very important for Girard and is a key to answer your question. There is a balance between Protestantism and Catholicism in Germany. So Madame de Staël was very fond of German Catholicism because it was open to an ecumenical approach, which happened later. And it's also very important for her that she discovered in Germany a religious attitude that reconciles faith and reason. So faith and reason, which was much more in a confrontational setting in France, was more reconciled in Germany. So Girard tells us that ecumenical spirit, a spirit that is able to integrate faith and reason, to don't see a cleavage between faith and reason, but how they can work together, is the key to the reconciliation and the spirit of forgiveness that enabled Konrad Adenauer, Charles de Gaulle, and Schuman was in the background of it, because Girard even refers to Robert Schuman saying that already his emphasis that France should give up the control over Ruhr was a very important first step towards the reconciliation that was later on enabled by Charles de Gaulle and Konrad Adenauer. So I could go a little bit deeper into that, but maybe that's enough for now.
Well, what we heard from Girard was he was talking about the mimetic desire, the copying, and what Maori has told us. France was the model. Germany wanted that dominance as well, and so 1870, Bismarck invades France. 1914, again, First World War. 1939, Second World War. It explains the conflict, but am I hearing you saying, Wolfgang, he doesn't so much spell out the reconciliation aspect? Is there a connection between the scapegoat was God's means of reconciliation. What was the means of reconciliation between the French and the Germans? The French, in the person of Robert Schuman, were prepared to lay down their right as a victor, as it were, and receive the Germans as equal players. Was this a sacrifice? Where does the sacrifice or the scapegoat element come into reconciliation?
Yeah, I don't see so much the scapegoat dimension in this regard. I rather would say, and this is a very strange. So if you look closer to these few pages where Girard talks about this new Europe, he suddenly talks very strongly about the Pope, about the infallibility about the Pope. And that's strange, at least for Protestants probably, and also for people from the Enlightenment. And I even know from German highbrow journalists, they were shocked when they read this chapter. But we should not be worried about what he says about infallibility of the Pope, because he goes into the substance and says the most important thing that John Paul II did, and this is for him a symbol of this new Europe, was his act of repentance in the year of 2000. So talking about the sins of the church, talking about the failings of the church, and overcoming all church longings for temporal power. And in some way, if you look closer, he also understood that as soon as the fathers of the unified Europe also understood how important it is to overcome this longing for temporal power and to look for a higher spiritual ground, then you can understand why reconciliation was possible. And I would explain it if we look back to the model that Mari presented us. If you reflect on what are the preconditions that mimetic desire turns towards violence, it very much depends also on the quality of the object of desire. And the mimetic desire, this is also very important, because otherwise reconciliation would not be possible. Mimetic desire is not automatically prone to a violent outcome. It's not prone to war, although war and violence and rivalry is highly likely, but it's not necessary. And if you look to the preconditions, how it can turn in this way and that way, it's very much depending on the object of desire. So if you seek worldly power, if you seek financial material gains, rivalry is highly likely. But human beings are not materialistic beings by default. We can also focus on cooperative goods. We can focus on the common good. We can focus on our spiritual sources. We can focus on not temporal goods, but on eternal goods. We can focus, we can orient ourselves towards God. And that's also was very important for these founding fathers of the European Unions. They were highly spiritual people who understood this essential difference between temporal goods and eternal goods. So there is a there is a very interesting passage in the book in Girard, and I discovered it yesterday again, and it's not unfolded, but I think what I just said is there. He talks about, Girard talks about in this book about European identity, and he talks about a new understanding of identity that says it's an identity of all people, and there is no longer a superior nation, and there is no longer a ranking between nations, but the identity of all people. And he says this identity is strengthened by reason, able to integrate the divine that this identity supposes. So this identity is strengthened by reason, able to integrate the divine that this identity supposes. So you see, he's very much emphasizing in his book a reconciliation between faith and reason. And in two passages where he talks about Europe, he talks about a reason that reconciles with the divine. So I think we have to understand it in the direction of reaching out for cooperative goods, reaching out for the common good, and reaching out for the divine. And he also, and then I'm concluding that, he also shortly talks about that in the background, you have to understand the influence of the Judeo-Christian revelation and the prophetic tradition. So it's very important that Girard always had a very close leaning to the prophetic tradition in Judaism. And I just was reading last week a little essay by Martin Buber on nationalism. And it's very interesting that also Martin Buber said, in order that nationalism doesn't become something narrow, something divisive, you need a nationalism who is oriented towards the supranational, is oriented towards faith. So you see here a very strong bridge between deep insights by a Jewish thinker in the prophetic tradition like Martin Buber and what Girard is hinting at. So you really have to read those 5-6 pages very carefully to see what he's saying. But he was, of course, very much in favor. So for him, this reconciliation between France and Germany was really a sign of hope and something very important, and something that ultimately stemmed from the spiritual influence, from this orientation towards the divine.
So just for clarification, did you say supernatural or supranational?
Supranational. But it's also, in that sense, one can misunderstand my word. It's also a rationality that goes beyond a narrow rationality by balancing faith and reason. So
Yeah.
where reason is able to incorporate faith, nationalism can also go beyond a narrow nationalism towards a supranational spirit. And the supranational spirit, of course, was a spirit that enabled people like Schuman and others to think about a Europe that reconciles different countries in a spirit of unity.
Yes, a community of people deeply rooted in Christian values. Mari?
I just wanted to add a few things. First of all, of course, we cannot ignore the fact that both Adenauer and Schuman, together with De Gasperi and the EU fathers, they have been committed Christians. And Jeff, you are the one who underlined several times this aspect in your book and in your talks. But without these leaders being rooted in their and committed to their Christian faith, it's hard to believe that a reconciliation would have been possible, because we do know that the relationship between the two countries were really icy by the end of the war. And something else that I would like to add to that is the role played by the moral rearmament and the Co-Palace institution and the work of the pastor Frank Bultmann, who made a lot of efforts to rebuild the bridges between, not only between the main leaders, in fact it came later, but between several groups of peoples both in France and in Germany. So that is a whole effort coming together, or building towards the reconciliation of the, well, maybe not reconciliation is not the word, but toward the trust that the two
Parties.
minister and chancellor were able to come together and listen to each other, and then to admit to go together into a reconciliation project. So that's these aspects who are not very well known are very significant. But my third point here is, I consider, and I'm not by any means a specialist, a scholar in this topic, but I think that reconciliation that they managed to bring together was very much influenced by the fear of Soviet Union. So because of that, we can see the Girardian schema, which means is the reconciliation of former rivals against a third party. So I think that that's something to explore more.
I would agree with this third point of Mari, and I mean this is the mixture of the founding of Europe. You have a spiritual core which really tries to reach out to even a unified globe to become an example of a unified globe in some way. And you have also this, and here the scapegoat mechanism in some way indirectly comes into play, that of course it's easier to reconcile if you have a common enemy.
Yeah.
And if we talk about the troubles of Europe since the end of the Cold War, you see that also Europe is in some way struggling to find a substitute for the former common enemy. So you had the left-wing people who said, we are other than the United States. And you have more the conservative people who found in Islam the other, which helps us to reconcile. Both, in my feeling, both played an important role and is still part of Europe, but both is not in the spirit of the founding fathers, who came from a different spiritual source to this unification. Of course, Adenauer also was a politician, so of course they also used this other thing, which made it easier for them to introduce their more spiritually guided idea of a common Europe with this situation of the Cold War. But even in Girard, you know, this whole book, it's a little bit strange, this chapter, because it's also a praise of Pope Benedict, who was just elected 2 years before. So Girard says the key moment of Europe is that now a German has become Pope, and he's a German and very much committed to Europe and also defending reason. And then he says, and finally even goes to Istanbul. So in some way, Girard's take on Islam was a little bit hesitant, as we saw in the movie before, but he also never wanted to make an enemy out of Islam. So even in this, the most striking situation is when the journalist who interviews Girard wanted to make him a strong statement against Islam, probably, and he refuses and says there are millions of people who are committed, faithful believers, and so I don't make any cheap things. And also this passage is interesting because he's reflecting on the Regensburg lecture, which was quite harsh on Islam, but then says this Pope goes to Istanbul, so reaching out beyond the typical pattern of Europe. But I fully agree with Mari, we have a mixture, and today we are facing still this mixture, and we have to avoid the trap of finding a common enemy in the pattern of scapegoats as helpers of unity, but go the other way and focus on cooperative goods. Fight the COVID crisis, fight the climate crisis. Those are the tasks that can unify, and we don't need an enemy as another nation or other people or other religion. There are enough enemies for humankind we have to face and find a good solution.
Can we look at the let's say the collapse of communism in the light of the Western Europe, the EU as it was, or it was still the EC, becoming the new model? There was a mimetic desire of the peoples of the East to share in what the West was enjoying. Can you apply the same theory to why communism collapsed?
Well, 1989 was a moment when the former enemy disappeared. So it was a challenge for Europe to see how we'll deal now with the new reality. And in my opinion, we could say that the spirits of the founding fathers were still there in the fact that Europe opened itself to the new states to become part of the club. But something to have in mind is that the European Union at the beginning was formed with a former maritime empire or empires. After 1989, the national states joined it. Now we look back and we consider us in Europe, all of us, as nation states. But it didn't start like that. It's Germany, Holland, Spain, they were not nation states until very recently in history. Well, the nation states were accepted into this privileged club. And I think this is the same attitude of not avoiding to become an obstacle. The EU didn't become an obstacle for the new states coming out of the Soviet control or influence. But Russia is still an enemy. And European Union, it's a solidarity with United States, or was in a solidarity with United States against Russia. So it seems to me like the European Union is constantly looking for this scapegoat of somebody as an enemy to keep us together. So I think what Professor Palaver just mentioned is the challenge in front of us. Are we able to focus on those challenges which are not a third party, another people? We had the next huge challenge in Europe with the immigration after the Syrian war, and we were not so open anymore. Well, with the states, of course, it's a complex process, it's a political process, there are norms. With immigration, it's a different sort of challenge, I accept. But Europe didn't express this welcoming, positive attitude towards others with immigration crisis. So are we able to focus in non-human challenges or dangers, or we constantly need somebody to blame for? I mean, America, it's an example for us. America, through the speech of its president, still speak about the Chinese virus. So do we constantly need somebody to blame, or are we able to be together against non-human challenges or dangers?
Wolfgang, a question for you. This is an area of your writing expertise. Are people interpreting the current developments in Europe and in the world through Girard's lenses? Can you give us some further reading in that light, or is that yet to be done?
Maybe there's still a lot to do in that direction. I think there are more and more people becoming interested in mimetic theory, and especially this book, Ascheweg Clausewitz, was received very well also outside church circles. So I remember the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, immediately after the publication of Girard's book, published himself a small book on French-German relationships and said what Girard had written is the most important book on French-German relationships. And there is a huge open field for researchers and people today to move forward in this direction. I was just reading the most recent book of Pope Francis. What is the title? Let Us Dream. And there's a lot on Europe in it, and there is a praise of Europe as the European Union having achieved reconciliation in difference. So people, I think, outside Europe, Latin America, see still the European Union as a very helpful model for all over the globe. And I was wondering, preparing this talk today, how Girard would have reacted about this new book by Pope Francis, because when I was reading it, I see it as very much in line with what Girard discovered and unfolding more the positive side, which was never very strong in Girard's writing. He's very good on really unfolding and discovering the problems, the roots of the problem, and is quite shy to give recipes and to unfold the positive side. And I think we, maybe the next generation of Girardians, have now the opportunity and are also challenged to move forward and also try to give positive answers with his analytical tools in the background.
Can you comment on the rise of populism in recent times? Because populism very much features scapegoating.
Mm-hmm. I mean, again, the Pope has in his new book brilliant passages on populism. He even talks about the temptation of populists to scapegoat, and the scapegoating aspect of populism is again something we can understand more properly with the help of mimetic theory. I mean, the Pope also makes the observation that sometimes the elites have not really engaged with the people in a broader sense. So the people were lost or were not taken seriously enough. So there is also a task so that the people who are leading the European Union, who are leading the different countries and so on, to really engage with the people and bring the people and these ideas of a unified Europe closer together. For me, populism is just one of the temptations that is part of human evolutionary history, that we always are easier in solidarity with a tribal group. So tribalism is a heritage that we carry along with us for probably millions of years. And this tribalism is always the easiest way in certain crises. And I've recently studied Girardian insights on Europe and the world on populism with the help of Henri Bergson and his distinction between static closed societies and open societies, and he combines it with static religion and open and dynamic religion. Dynamic religion, this prophetic spirit so visible in Judaism, in the prophetic tradition, and in Christianity, is the enabler of unification in the sense of focusing towards eternal goods, also by overcoming the temptations of imperialism, because all those longings for material good, for political, financial, material superiority is much closer to the pattern of closed societies and to populism. And so therefore, the closed society is something that in times of crisis most easily attracts people and helps them to form community or give them security in times of crisis. But it's a path that is today in a highly technical world a very dangerous path because it can cause wars again. And we should not forget there is a common legacy between the founding fathers of the European Union and Girard. And again, you have to read Girard very carefully. He was always very critical of philosophers. But there was one philosopher also in his last book he praised and gave some positive value, and it was Jacques Maritain. And Jacques Maritain comes out of this Bergsonian tradition to emphasize global fraternity, to overcome anti-Semitism and so on. So Girard and the founding fathers of Europe go back to Bergson and Maritain in this spirit. And it's also interesting, if I would have to give a very quick answer to what Girard would recommend to find a positive identity in Europe, he would say, try to follow the path of saintliness. So saintliness is very important. And again, you find it in those thinkers. So Maritain understood that Europe needs to have saints again that are models for us. And it's a good thing that the founding fathers of Europe, Schuman especially, and de Gasperi are in a process of becoming saints. And Girard again and again also said, so he was very shy on the positive side, but already 30 or 40 years ago, he was in a meeting with American theologians, and they asked him, what shall we do? We understand your analysis of the world, but what is your recipe? And he said, try to achieve saintliness. And they were a little bit shocked. They were theologians, said, what does that mean? But I think if we reflect on this a little bit more carefully and unfold what it means to go the path of saintliness, we can understand that this is an important task. And I read Pope Francis' messages, Fratelli Tutti, his emphasis on fraternity, especially in this direction of a positive answer following the insights of Girard's mimetic theory.
As someone who comes from a Baptist evangelical background, talk about sainthood is not something we're always fully comfortable with. But I have often said, in all my reading about Robert Schuman, I have not found anything negative about him. And of course, all of our heroes have feet of clay. I haven't yet discovered what that might be with Robert Schuman. And at one stage, he was considering going into the priesthood, but a good friend advised him that the saints of tomorrow will be wearing suits. In other words, we need people, godly people, in all spheres of life. And I wonder if, I don't want to put either of you on the spot, but can you make a comment about how mimetic theory can help us understand what's going on with Brexit? Is that something you'd like to comment on? Probably not.
I mean, maybe Mari wants to.
Just a thought, and it's not, I didn't reflect on that, so it's not the result of a deep reflection. I think it's the old path. It's so easy for the current political class in England to find a scapegoat. So the Europe is guilty for everything that doesn't go well in England.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And can it guide us how those in the rest of Europe should respond?
I will add that what England did, in fact, in transforming into political action this negative attitude toward Europe, it's basically we find in many of our European countries, parts of the population being against Europe or very Eurosceptical, etc. They didn't prevail in other countries so far. But it's the same tendency of blaming Brussels, blaming European Union for things that are not going well in our own lives, in our own country. If we do not have Brussels to blame anymore, we'll blame our own political leaders. So we constantly find somebody to blame, and this is mainly Girard.
Thank you. Wolfgang, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I just underline that. That's true. And what should Europe do? We should not get resentful. We should not get too much worried. We should make Europe an attractive model that countries want to join. And if we succeed in that, if we would succeed in that direction, maybe in a decade or two, another government, another spirit in Great Britain wants to join again.
Well,
Exactly. The way that Europe acts now toward England in this process may go into the reciprocal attitude. I mean, you want that, so we pay back. Or Europe could act not mimetical and treat very well England, so become attractive, as Professor Palaver mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
One closing thought. Wolfgang, you talked about this tribalism that's been part of the human DNA. What is the factor that Christianity brings to the world that enables us to overcome this tribalism?
I think Christianity, like Judaism, and I would say also Islam, the Abrahamic religions, and probably all so-called post-exile religion, are part of what Bergson described as this dynamic religion that aims towards open society and also to a universal fraternity. And you can clearly see it in key passages of the New Testament. And there are two passages I always like to reflect on and take as an illustration for this insight. The first is the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus said, you all know it, or it was said to you, you should love your friends and hate your enemies. And it's interestingly, there was a long discussion because many Christians understood this passage in an anti-Semitic, anti-Judaistic way that said the Jews hated their enemies and loved their friends, and we Christians overcame that. In the most recent translation of the Bible in the Catholic German tradition, this quote from the Old Testament is in italics, but only the first part. So only it was said you should love your friends. The part you should hate your enemies is not in italics because it's not in the Old Testament. So how should we read that passage? This passage we have to read anthropologically with the insight of Girard, because it refers to this pattern of parochial altruism, as some of the scientists today call it, that it's the most easiest thing for people to form solidarity against another group. So Jesus is really telling us in this passage, we all know this is the most likely thing we are going along with, but we should go the other way. And the second passage I also want to refer to is the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is probably also often misunderstood today, because a Samaritan for us is a positive model. So we do no longer understand the political background of this passage. The Samaritan was an enemy of the people, of the Jews at that time. So when Jesus gave the Samaritan as their model, how you should love your neighbor, this was a scandal. So if you translate it today, it would mean to talk to Jewish people and take a Hamas fighter probably as a model person for love one's neighbor. So these are passages which show how Christianity really revolutionizes the typical pattern of living together. So you can only understand it with this revolutionary and dynamic spirit of what Bergson called dynamic religion. It blows up the typical patterns, but it's a it's a long, ongoing, slow process because we still are closer to the old pattern than to the new one. Still, the parable of the Good Samaritan is, if you reflect carefully on it, a challenge to us. And so again, I would want to highlight that in the center of the recent encyclical of Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, there is a deep reflection on the parable of the Good Samaritan. So the Pope understands quite well how important it is to bring these biblical stories again at the center of our reflection and attention.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Thank you, Mari. That's a very good way to wrap up our conversation. We all need to remember that the heart of this vision for this European, I'll call it, community of peoples is seeking the common good. And it is only if our leaders get back to that spirit of Europe that we will see that model emerging that you were talking about. Seeking the common good together rather than just seeing this as an economic project that is going to boost our gross national product. So thank you very much indeed for your contribution to this Schuman talk, which is our last for this year. We are actually going to take a sabbatical during January. Our next Schuman talk is going to be on February the 9th. And if we can see that slide, Cedric, I should say Cedric is behind the scenes working things. This is his very last time with us because he will be leaving us in the Schuman Center as of the end of the year. And we want to thank you, Cedric, for your help in getting these Schuman talks started. And the speaker we're going to have for the next Schuman talk is Dr. David Koisis, the author of a very significant book called Political Visions and Illusions, which spells out how that most political ideologies are rooted in idolatrous worldviews, but there are some models based on biblical thinking holding hope for the realities of the 21st century. So we want to welcome you on February the 9th to come and listen to David Koisis as well. So with this, we'll take our leave. We wish you a very special Christmas season and all the very best wishes for the new year. Thank you.
Thank you.